would really be cable television as we know it today if there had not been Bill Daniels. The industry opened up the world, knocked down the barriers and the borders between countries and between cultures and between people.
Bill had expressed many times that we had a public service obligation. We were not just in the business of making money or whatever, but had a public purpose.
He coined the phrase, free enterprise is the eighth wonder of the world, and he truly believed that. He believed that through successful business, so many people are served, and that the bottom line took care of itself if you did the business well.
Bill always said to me, look, you're not going to impress me when you do a deal with somebody. How you'll impress me is if you do another deal with the same guy, right? Because that means you did a fair deal the first time around.
Entrepreneurialism was the pathway, but what really defined Bill for most of us were those things that he did with the benefits of his entrepreneurial gains.
When people talk about what was it like, working for him, I've heard these great stories. I always answer, you know what, it was better than what you heard. It was the opportunity of a lifetime.
I think much of what we know about Bill today and his defining characteristics come from his mother. His gentleness, his compassion, his kindness were attributes that his mother had. Where the competitive, combative side of Bill came from, I'm not sure. And I think it might have had something to do with his size and the fact that he had to be a tough guy to survive. And he demonstrated that, and that's why he ended up at the New Mexico Military Institute at the insistence of his parents. And then, of course, the skill that he acquired there in becoming a boxer, an athlete. He loved sports.
He grew up through the Depression. He was definitely influenced by that. He was also influenced by his father. He clearly got his work ethic from his father. He went to work in the insurance business, which was his father's business. He was unbelievably committed to his mother to her last day.
He went into the military at a time when our country was at war, flying in combat missions and engaging with enemy aircraft obviously give you a competitive skill that some people just don't get. So I think military was a more important formational place for Bill than was his educational base. His patriotism, love for the country, his willingness to give his life to preserve his country's ideals, his very disciplined, focused upbringing, and the military. Those two things really defined Bill for the rest of his life.
I was leaving New Mexico to go to Casper, Wyoming, and I had never seen television. And I stopped at a bar in Denver for a corned beef sandwich and a beer. And they had a black and white television on with a fight. And I was taken with that invention. I said, I'm looking forward to see more of that when I get to Casper. I got to Casper and there was no television. And I thought there has to be a way to get television to small cities.
If you go back in the history of cable, in the beginning, cable was serving communities that didn't otherwise get television. And they were so happy to have us that they would follow the trucks around. When are you coming to my neighborhood?
What little broadcast signals they got through rabbit ears on the TV and wires was often not very clear, not very reliable. So what it did was deliver a product, which was primarily broadcast television, into communities that couldn't get it ordinarily because the broadcaster was too far from that community, or there was obstruction, like mountains.
I was living in Southern California, and I called on him, and I still had my Marine Corps butch haircut. He was a Navy guy, so we got a lot of laughs about me being the junior member of his service organization. Because in my time and in Bill's, the formation we got from that, I think, was priceless. When I first went to work for Bill in 1965, we were a very small shop. The cable industry was a very small industry, something less than 500,000 subscribers in the whole country. And our little office at the corner of 3rd and Milwaukee. Bill evolved, as many great leaders do, in this fledgling industry. We all know the story about this new technology, and he wanted to be a part of it. So in becoming a part of it and putting his roots down in Casper, Wyoming, and then ultimately moving to Denver to establish Daniels and Associates, I think Bill basically exuded a pretty high level of enthusiasm and passion for the industry that he was in. He became the catalyst for helping form a national association to lobby in Washington and have our voice heard, to fight the efforts against us imposed by telephone companies, newspapers, as well as broadcasters. He looked at every opponent as an opponent that we could ultimately win over, as opposed to one that we had to destroy. In the very early days when the cable industry was fighting its big battles with broadcasters, Bill regularly sent notes and communicated with people who were recognized in Broadcasting Magazine. Congratulations. Didn't make any difference whether this guy was president of NBC or, an engineer in Sacramento. As a result, I think Bill and his colleagues and his firm had an entree that made it very possible for us later on to play a big role in bringing broadcasters, newspaper organizations into the ownership of the cable industry. The biggest challenge for Bill in the early 50s was survival. I mean, this is a fledgling industry. There's no script for how you're going to get from here to there. To be able to get by from today to next payroll was a constant challenge for Bill. He saw the industry as ultimately being in every home in the United States, and very few people shared that vision. And it was infectious because it permeated our industry, and it helped develop the industry to its outer bounds by bringing in major players, broadcasters, newspapers, large venture capital firms. It helped grow the industry, and I think he singularly was very helpful in making that happen. That was a very early stage of developing Daniels and Associates because there were very few assets in total, and only a minimum of those that somebody would say is for sale. So more often than not in those days, the big job was knocking on doors, talking to cable operators and saying, would you have any interest maybe in joining a larger group or selling your company? That's how the brokerage business got started for Bill. But playing that role enabled him to be a focal point because he was the only one doing that. This was too small for Wall Street. So it was primarily Bill and his persona that were causing whatever few deals were being made to happen. He was the deal maker. The business was very unpredictable. The brokerage side of the business was feast or famine. You could work a long time on a transaction and it wouldn't close. They were very difficult financial times.
I'm not the first guy to get in cable TV, but I was the first guy that thought this can be a big business, and this is a business that's going to take big money and big players, and we need to go out and find the capital, educate the banks, and make a real business out of it.
When I joined it in '65, there wasn't a specific focus. We were a small group of people. Bill was clearly the head of it. Monty Rifkin, by title, was president of the operating company. The two other guys that were there and myself had a responsibility to just develop business, and brokerage was the area of opportunity. Operating a cable system would be akin to managing a 7-Eleven store or whatever. You had a franchise area, let's say, to pick a town that we were in those days, Fort Dodge, Iowa. And the cable system embodied the construction of lines and amplifiers and electronics that would cover the entire town. The employees of the company would be engineers, service people, maintenance people, customer service people, and a manager that kept all of that together to manage those assets. The Daniels Group had a management contract over that, so the direction of the cable system in Fort Dodge and the direction to its employees was set by the organization in Denver. So the budgets would be prepared, our engineer would have an impact, our marketing person would have an impact, and they would guide the decisions that would be made at the system level to achieve its success. The typical cable system was 5 channels. In 1965, introduced for the very first time was a new technology called transistorized amplifiers. Prior to that, everything was tube type, and transistorized amplifiers and a channel capacity of 12 channels. And everybody thought, wow, what in the world would you ever do with 12 channels? Because you only had NBC, CBS, ABC, PBS, and in some markets, 1, maybe 2 big markets like Los Angeles and New York, 3 independent stations. Cable systems in the late 60s, early 70s were small businesses. For example, in 65, we bought a cable system in an area called Saugus, Newhall, California, and I think the purchase price was $800,000, and the business had like 1,500 subscribers. And that was a pretty common template for the cable industry because the major markets, places like Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, had good television reception, didn't need cable. Our play in the outlying markets was that either distance or terrain would impair the quality of the signal receiving the set directly. So we would go at a high point, build our head in, and then distribute the cable through the community. So it's very much a small business, involved primarily in installations, trouble calls, billing and collecting, and trying to add subscribers. And so it was a business that was well suited to a centralization of a management group that had expertise in marketing, engineering, operations, so that the offices, while being somewhat independent, were doing so off of that template of an oversight that had a lot of depth and strength to it. In 1965. Bill and Monty Rifkin had entered into a relationship with Royal Little, famous entrepreneur, and we went out, found cable systems. We'd buy those cable systems. So over a period of about 5 years, these assets were pulled together, and ultimately Monty had the vision and approval from Bill to create this as a public entity. So it became one of the first public cable television companies, went public in 1968, and that became ATC, which ultimately became Time Inc. Monty was chosen by Bill, because he had been the architect of it, to go with that company and be its public CEO. Bill's now got a bunch of stock, but a diminished presence because all of the operating assets are gone. And that was a great source of revenue on a monthly basis, very predictable revenue coming from the management of those systems.
I met Bill shortly after I moved to Denver, really. I got a job at ATC, American Television and Communications Corporation, and Bill had just contributed his systems to form ATC, so he was one of our largest shareholder and officed right across the street. He asked a lot of questions, and I didn't know who this person was, and I didn't know much about him, as a matter of fact. What really impressed me was the second time I met him, that he actually not only took the time to talk to me again, but had remembered everything from our first conversation. That's a unique talent. He really took the time to get to know people and get to know their families, get to know their personal situation, and was genuinely interested.
I actually met him at a meeting when we were planning to build out Mile High Cable. It was prior to Denver franchising, and we were one of the applicants to get the Denver franchise. I remember when he talked about how important it was to get the Denver franchise, but we were going to do it the way it's supposed to be done. We're going to offer the best package. That's how we're going to get it. One of the things that ATC and Bill Daniels did not believe in that was happening in the industry back then, there were a lot of things going on that were not exactly above board. Bill wanted to treat everybody honestly, and one of the things that I heard about him during those days is how he would get into deals with very little paper and pencil, and merely a handshake would really consummate the deal.
So at that point, we go to the market and start to try to find a new equity partner. So we end up with Travelers Insurance and a venture capital arm that Travelers had. And we start to buy cable systems with Travelers. It was during that period of time that Bill, first of all, he acquired the LA Stars, moved them to Utah, got very diversified at a time when we couldn't afford the diversification, had used the stock of the company that we had created with Travelers to pledge to banks to secure loans to feed the basketball operation. So we were faced with a scenario of how can we keep these creditors at bay? Bill is stepping out to run for governor of Colorado. Then the Utah Stars goes bankrupt, and in about 1979, at the height of very bad economic time in our country, I went to Travelers with a proposal, and I said, I think we can get $100 million for the company, a number which would clearly satisfy Travelers, all of these people, and provide plenty of benefits left over. One of the analysts said, so let me see if I understand this. He said, if you can get $100 million for the company, that's a valuation of 10 times your negative net worth. And I said, well, I hadn't looked at it from that standpoint, but you're right. We literally, on the balance sheet, had a $10 million negative net worth, assets being worth $10 million less than our liabilities. But we did. We got that deal, and that was a big payday. At the end of that one, Bill got all of his creditors paid off. Travelers made a very nice payday. Bill's key employees made a very nice payday, and Bill had about $25 million pre-tax. Bill, all along with the incident of filing bankruptcy with the Utah Stars, had this pressing obligation mentally, morally, to satisfy all of his creditors. I think it ended up being like $800,000. But almost before we even closed, Bill is preparing to go back to Salt Lake to pay off those creditors. He's got a list of every one of them, how much money he had defaulted with them on, and what would he owe them, including interest. And that was, I think, one of the most joyful times in Bill's life. More joyful than having made the money from having built up the company and sold it was the satisfaction he got of honoring his liabilities and protecting and preserving his name. I think none of us were surprised by the fact that he was hell-bent to do this because he had talked about it, and it's who he was. I mean, he's not going to stiff anybody. He often said his two objectives in life, one, he wanted to go to heaven, and B, he wanted to go without owing anybody any money or mad at him.
Well, the company in 1980 were principally in the brokerage business, representing owners of cable systems in selling their system or helping them finance a system or finding systems for other major cable companies. John Siemens' concept, and I think Bill's, was to reestablish themselves in the operating side of the cable business and more ownership in cable systems. We had to get additional firepower in terms of employees in the corporation because it became much more of a sophisticated business. We were able to do that because we hired the right people, and then they hired the right people. And from there, we became very successful operators.
Bill was highly regarded in the industry because he was a very, very early player. He always was there promoting cable. He was just always pushing the industry to do better with its employees, with their communities that they serve. Bill's philosophy was, if you spend time doing business right, the money will follow, the profits will follow.
We gave participation to everybody in the home office here, right down to the receptionist. So when that partnership was sold, or the property within that partnership was sold, and we received proceeds from that, each person got a check. And so that inspired people. Bill believed that they were going to do whatever was necessary to be successful. It's surprising how many people don't get that in industry then and even today, that there's this free enterprise concept in his mind. If you incent the people and get good people, they will run through walls for you as part of that process. He understood that.
A company is people. People make the company. I don't make it. The product doesn't make it. The people make it. And I just want you to know I'm awful damn proud of all of you.
So I was locating property to build a regional office, and I was showing Bill various locations. We literally pulled over into the weeds off of El Camino Real in Carlsbad and had a map spread out over the hood of the car. Bill is quickly bored, and he said, look, here's what I want to do. And on the back of this envelope, the one word that he starts with is Regional Sports Network. And he said, I want you to get yourself out, figure out how we can build a regional sports network, because I think that's going to be a great business for us in the future. And that was it, Prime Ticket.
I think it started as box seat in San Diego. San Diego, by the analysis that was being done by Tony Acone, who led the effort, wasn't a big enough market to make it a big business. So Tony convinced Bill, we need to start talking about Los Angeles. Tony moved his attention to talking to Jerry Buss of the Lakers, the guy that owned the Kings, SC, UCLA, Dodgers, et cetera, et cetera. And that's when that really took off. And then Bill started to participate in the startup of other networks, Houston, et cetera, et cetera. And so it became a critically important component of who Bill was. And to the extent that he concentrated energies, it was in directing the growth and the direction of Prime Ticket. It was a great love of his. Bill would not miss a Laker game. And he would not be bashful about calling a Prime Ticket cameraman or the director in the studio and saying, you just blew it there, or you need to do this. He was very hands-on, which was atypical. Well, Bill was always a big believer in the fact that programming was going to be king, and it was hard to imagine back in the days when all you had was broadcast television. But Bill had this belief and this vision that all these things were going to be created. He wouldn't be able to sit down and write you a list of, we're going to have ESPN and C-SPAN and CNN and Fox News and Prime Ticket Sports Network. He didn't know any of that stuff, other than his vision that this is how the cable industry was going to make its mark in America and allow us to become a wired nation for cable TV. A cable programmer could have a great idea. The idea was no good without eyeballs. We controlled the eyeballs. TCI controlled more of them. ATC controlled a lot of them. We at Daniels controlled a fair number, but we were always a player in the startup of all these different programming networks. We're now in the middle 80s, and our company is really doing well on all fronts.
Once there were satellites that were functional, it became economically attractive to cable larger cities. And that's when the business really broke out into the big time, which in the beginning was really a burden, but became quite profitable once we had the programming that the city dwellers could not otherwise receive. And that was a whole new world that hadn't existed before and that we couldn't have imagined before. Bill was an advocate of less government regulation and that we had, as cable operators, responsibilities that we should stick to. And he also played a significant role in the deregulation that occurred in the mid-'80s.
Deregulation did open up a golden age because at the same time as deregulation, we were starting to get exciting new programming. We had new pay services coming on board. We already had HBO, but we were getting Showtime and many others.
From the company's standpoint, the 80s were a great time of development for Daniels and Associates, the brokerage investment banking part of our business. By the mid-80s, it was a very large revenue producer at the company and a very large cash flow contributor to the company, and was creating a real conflict with the operating company because the operating company had an appetite to buy cable systems. The brokers were generating listings on cable systems.
Reputation-wise in the industry, we were getting criticized for being both a broker and a buyer.
It became evident that we had to separate these two businesses. If Bill had a love for our businesses, it wasn't the nuts and bolts of operations, although he recognized the value of operations. His heart was always kind of the deal-making side of the business. He took more pride in what we did there. So the decision was made to sell the operating company in 1988. And at that point, Daniels and Associates was free to stand alone, and we were out of the operating business.
The M&A side of the business was his first love. So at the Daniels and Associates side, he was very much involved. At the time, the business was changing so quickly. He was always available, and particularly if there was a need for him to make a call on someone or to go someplace with us on a deal. We were very much involved early on in the development of the wireless business, but we were a M&A shop to all of the communications businesses, whether it's wireless, wired, the data infrastructure business. If you had asked him about the deal-making side of his business, he had always talked about ethics and integrity and how he dealt with people in hundreds, he would say, of deals that he would get done simply on a handshake. And he was very much focused on his ethics and integrity of his team. He would tell you he knew the quality of the leaders in the business and the next generation of the entrepreneurs that he saw coming up. I think he'd be thrilled when he walked in the door and saw you watching TV on your phone.
Cable sure has changed the world. We've learned a lot more about each other, for better or for worse, as a result of cable. Bill's most important legacy is really a standard of behavior, a standard of ethics, a standard of respect for everyone.
Almost every speech that Bill would make dealt on the industry, where's it going, what's it doing.
All 4 Denver stations are on 24 hours a day. Why? Competition from cable and the American public has benefited. A perfect case of free enterprise at its best.
He loved to talk about you never know, which was his way of saying you treat every person with dignity and respect, and you never know who you might be talking to and how that might come back. We have a responsibility to give back. Bill preached that. He ran ads on it. We need to be good citizens. We need to be proud of our country. We need to be supportive of the free enterprise system. We need to help out those less privileged than ourselves. He did that.
I learned a lot from Bill. Part of it was the way he treated people. He would walk around the whole office, and people looked forward to seeing him, and he would talk to everyone. He also was a great listener. If you were talking to him, he had this great ability to hear what you were saying, and he would follow up in many different ways.
Bill felt nothing was better than the free enterprise system. And I must admit that he made the free enterprise system seem available and approachable for everybody. Bill quietly did his part in welcoming people, regardless of gender, regardless of race. If people wanted to work, wanted a job, wanted to make something of themselves, he was always there to help them.
He showed you by example what integrity really means. He showed you by example what loyalty really means. You never heard Bill talk about employees. It was always associates.
After 1 year in the cable business in Casper, Wyoming, I publicly stated that we would see a wired nation. And somebody asked me how many channels I think there eventually would be on cable. And I said, oh, 100, 200, this is 15 years ago. Shortly after Casper opened, I said, if we're going to have two-way capability, there'll be a day when you don't have to go to the library. Well, that's today on the internet. You don't have to go to the library. But I just think there's no limit as long as we conduct ourselves properly. With electronics and the communications revolution we live in, God, it's just getting started. And that's the legacy that I leave, and I'm damn proud of that, I'll tell you.